The house looked ordinary from the outside. A listing buried deep in the Craigslist classifieds described it simply, two-bedroom fixer-upper, must go fast. But the photographs told a different story. The boards were warped from years of neglect. The paint faded to the color of dead bone, and the windows looked less like glass and more like hollow sockets staring out into a world that had forgotten it. It was the kind of image most people would scroll past without a second thought. Yet for one person it seemed like an opportunity. A cheap rental, a chance to start fresh, a bargain hiding in plain sight. That is how the story begins, innocently, casually, without warning of the shadow that was waiting inside. There are places in this world that should never be entered. Spaces where the air feels older than memory itself. This house was one of them. The photographs had been cropped so carefully that the viewer never noticed the shapes in the corners, the distortions at the edge of the frame. It was only later, long after the meeting had been arranged, that people wondered if those details were hints, warnings too faint to be heard. Craigslist was supposed to be a marketplace, a bridge between strangers, but in truth it was also a hunting ground, and those who walked in blindly could not always walk back out. The night the door swung open for the first time, there was no laughter or friendly greeting, only silence. The buyer stepped inside, thinking about the deal he was about to make. He did not notice the chill in the hallway, nor the way the shadows seemed thicker than they should be. He thought of the ad, the message exchanges, the way the seller had insisted on cash only. He ignored the unease because he wanted to believe he was in control. But Craigslist has a way of disguising danger in the language of opportunity. How many times has a simple ad led someone to a place they never should have been? In the years since, fragments of this night have surfaced in whispered accounts, police reports, and late-night confessions. No one can agree on what truly happened inside the house. Some say the buyer vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his car parked at the edge of the driveway. Others insist that neighbors heard screams but chose not to call anyone, afraid of what they might discover. The truth is obscured, drowned beneath half-remembered details and the silence of those who never returned. It is easy to dismiss stories like this as urban legends, exaggerated tales meant to frighten. Yet the pattern is undeniable. Craigslist has always carried with it an undercurrent of danger. Behind the cheap furniture, the job postings, the casual encounters, there are doors that lead to places where no one should follow. This house was one such door, and the buyer stepped through it without knowing that on the other side waited not a transaction, but something that would consume him entirely. Think about it. How many times have you answered an online ad and walked into a stranger's home? How many times have you trusted that the person on the other end of the message was who they claimed to be? In the glow of a computer screen, it feels harmless. But the moment you arrive, the moment the door clicks shut behind you, the control slips away. It is then you realize that the ad was never about selling or trading at all. It was bait, and you were the one being hunted. In this story, the photographs of the house still exist. They have been shared on obscure forums, dissected by those who believe in omens and those who only see coincidence. Some claim that in the top right window, there is a figure watching. Others argue it is a trick of light, nothing more. But the longer you stare, the harder it becomes to convince yourself it is empty. What haunts the most is not what is seen, but what is felt. That sense of being observed through glass that should reflect nothing. The ad was eventually taken down, of course. Removed after reports began to circulate, after families demanded answers about their missing son, their missing daughter, their missing friend. Yet the memory of it lingers. Archived screenshots, stray emails, screenshots of the text messages that started with hope and ended in silence. Each fragment paints a picture, but the center of the canvas remains dark. What happened inside that house? What was waiting in those rooms that had not been lived in for years? No one who entered has been able to explain it fully. Some speak of hearing footsteps on the stairs even when the house was supposed to be empty. Others recall the smell, rot and dampness heavy enough to make breathing difficult. There are mentions of a door in the basement that did not appear in the floor plans, a door that led downward, even though the house was not supposed to have a lower level at all. Stories like this do not end cleanly. They fracture, splinter, and lodge themselves in the mind like broken glass. Perhaps that is the true horror. Not knowing whether the house still stands, whether someone else has since listed it again, whether even now a new buyer is walking through its door. Craigslist refreshes every hour. New ads appear every minute. And hidden among them, There may always be another house, another trap, another ending waiting for someone who only wanted a bargain. So ask yourself before you scroll through those listings, before you step into a stranger's home for a deal that seems too good to ignore, how well do you really know the person on the other side of the screen? What if they are not selling you something at all? What if what they want is you? The house did not appear suddenly. It had been there for decades, rotting in silence. A structure built when the town was still alive with industry and community pride. Time had turned those memories into something brittle. Families had once gathered inside its walls. Children had run through its halls, but the echoes of laughter had long been smothered by dust and silence. By the time the Craigslist listing appeared, the house was no longer a home. It was an artifact of abandonment, standing at the edge of a town that preferred to forget it existed. The community around it carried its own fractures. A once busy mill had closed years earlier, and with it went the livelihood of hundreds. People left, businesses boarded up, and the town began to shrink into itself. Those who stayed behind grew accustomed to empty streets and dark windows. They passed the old house on the hill and spoke of it only in fragments. No one claimed it, and no one cared to step inside. To outsiders, it was just another neglected property in a forgotten corner of the state. But to those who lived nearby, it carried an unease that could not be explained away. Stories about the house circulated quietly, never in official records but in whispers exchanged in dimly lit diners or over cigarettes on back porches. Some said they had seen shapes move in the upper windows. Others recalled that the house had changed hands more times than anyone could count. But no one stayed longer than a few months. The occupants always left in haste, some abandoning furniture, others vanishing altogether. The police never investigated deeply. It was easier to say people had moved on, chasing work or running from debts. But the unease remained, a quiet current beneath the surface of local memory. The Craigslist ad gave the house a new kind of visibility. For outsiders, there was no history attached, only opportunity, cheap rent, low asking price, the promise of a deal too good to ignore. The seller never gave much detail, only an email address and the instruction that cash would be required. The photographs were cropped tight, never showing the surrounding land, only the walls and windows that seemed ready to collapse. But desperation can silence suspicion. For someone looking to escape or someone hunting for the illusion of ownership, this house seemed like a chance worth taking. The person who answered the ad came from outside the town. He was not tied to its history, not burdened with the stories that had shaped the house into a silent warning. For him, it was a calculation. He had been searching for something affordable, something out of the way, a place where he could rebuild what he felt had been taken from him. Craigslist provided what he thought he wanted. He did not notice the inconsistencies in the photographs, the shadows that seemed too dark for daylight. He did not ask why the seller refused to meet anywhere else. It is easy to say in hindsight that he should have known better, but hindsight is always cruelly clear. At the time, the decision made sense. An empty house in a forgotten town meant privacy, freedom, and the possibility of a new start. The silence of the community did not register as warning. The boarded windows looked like repairs waiting to happen. The chipped paint felt like work that could be completed in time. He saw only what he wanted, and the house offered itself as a vessel for that illusion. The town itself had begun to feel like an extension of the house. Few ventured near the property, and fewer still spoke about it. Even those who had stories avoided detail, as if speaking them aloud might call something closer. The memory of former occupants remained scattered, like broken pieces of glass that never quite fit back together. One family was said to have left in the middle of the night, abandoning furniture and food still in the refrigerator. Another left after their child claimed to hear voices in the walls. No one admitted these stories openly, but everyone seemed to know them. The buyer would not have heard these warnings. He only had the Craigslist posting, stripped of history, sterilized by text on a glowing screen. It offered nothing of the house's past, nothing of the community's silence. The ad erased context, leaving only a promise, and that promise drew him closer, step by step, until he stood in the driveway with cash in his pocket and hope in his chest. The deeper context of the house is what haunts the most. Buildings carry memory, and memory does not always fade with paint or repairs. What lingers in the walls, in the boards that creak and groan under invisible weight, is not erased by time. Those who lived there before had left fragments of themselves behind. Those who feared the house had left silence in its place, and now, through Craigslist, the cycle had been renewed. A stranger was about to step into a place where history had never truly ended. This is the context that underpins the story. A forgotten town, a house with too many departures, a listing that ignored everything except the promise of a quick deal. It is the collision of anonymity and history, of technology's cold efficiency and memory's haunting persistence. Craigslist stripped away the warnings, the whispers, the fragments of human fear that surrounded the house. What remained was a simple message, a price, and a stranger ready to answer. The past of the house had been buried under silence, but silence is not absence. It waits, it lingers, and when the door opened again, it was there to greet him. The first messages exchanged between the buyer and the seller were ordinary, simple words, polite arrangements, the kind of cold efficiency that comes with online transactions. A date was set, an hour chosen. Cash would be brought, keys would be handed over, everything straightforward. But nothing about what followed was straightforward at all. From the moment the buyer began the drive into the town, details began to unsettle him. The road itself felt wrong, stretched longer than it should have, lined with trees that leaned inward as though conspiring to keep outsiders away. The navigation app directed him through streets with names that seemed unfamiliar, even though he had studied the map earlier. It was as though the path was shifting beneath his tires, guiding him somewhere he had not agreed to go. Yet he kept driving. Curiosity, hope, and a strange sense of inevitability pressed him forward. As he entered the town, the silence struck him. No one walked the sidewalks. Windows stared blankly from houses that looked as though they had been abandoned for decades. Stores stood shuttered, their signs faded, some letters missing entirely. There was life somewhere, he thought, but it kept itself hidden. The directions led him past the town square, past a gas station that looked empty despite its flickering neon, and finally to a road that climbed toward the edge of the forest. There, at the end of a gravel path choked with weeds, the house waited. It looked worse in person than in the photographs. Boards sagged, paint peeled, the roof slanted as if the house itself were bowing under an invisible weight. The buyer paused at the edge of the driveway, gripping the steering wheel. Something felt deeply wrong, but he had already driven too far, already invested too much of himself in this decision. He told himself it was just an old house. Old houses looked like this. Yet in his chest his heart beat harder than it should have. He stepped out and the air hit him. Damp, heavy, and sharp with the smell of soil that had never dried. The wind carried no sound except the rustle of branches. He expected to see the seller waiting on the porch, perhaps leaning against the frame, perhaps already walking down the steps to greet him. But the porch was empty. The door stood ajar, dark inside, a hollow mouth inviting him forward. The buyer called out once. No answer. He called again, his voice quieter than he intended, swallowed quickly by the trees. With each step toward the porch, the wood beneath his shoes creaked, loud against the silence. He hesitated, then placed his hand against the door. The paint flaked beneath his fingers, and when he pushed, the door swung open with no resistance. Inside, the air was colder. Shadows clung to the walls, and the smell was stronger now. Rot mixed with dampness, something organic but long decayed. His footsteps echoed softly, though the rooms around him stood empty. A single chair lay overturned in the corner, its legs broken. A cracked mirror leaned against the wall, reflecting his movements in distorted fragments. He expected the seller to appear at any moment, to explain the state of the place, to reassure him that it only looked worse than it truly was. But no voice came, no footsteps approached. The silence deepened until even his own breathing felt intrusive. He walked through the living room, past torn curtains and windows smeared with grime, into the kitchen where the cabinets hung open like gaping mouths. It was there, in the kitchen, that he first felt it, the sense that someone else was in the house with him. Not in front of him, not behind him, but above. The creak of wood on the second floor, faint but undeniable. He froze, waiting for movement, listening to the shift of weight in the ceiling beams. His first thought was that the seller was upstairs, perhaps waiting, perhaps trying to test him. But something in the sound felt wrong. Too slow, too deliberate, as though whoever moved was in no hurry at all. He called out again, louder this time, but his voice only struck the walls and came back hollow. The footsteps above him stopped. Silence stretched long enough to make him wonder if he had imagined it. Then, just as suddenly, something scraped across the floorboards upstairs. A dragging sound, steady, deliberate, impossible to mistake. Every instinct told him to leave, to step back through the kitchen, through the front door, into the light outside, but curiosity and a strange, stubborn pull kept him still. He wanted to believe it was nothing, just the house settling, just his mind playing tricks. And yet when he looked at the staircase, the darkness between the railings seemed deeper than shadow. The mystery was building around him piece by piece, the unanswered messages, the silence of the town, the absence of the cellar, the footsteps above. Each detail layered upon the next until the house itself felt like a trap closing slowly, one hinge at a time. He told himself he would only glance at the upper floor to put his fears to rest. But even as he placed his hand on the banister, he knew he was lying to himself. The wood groaned beneath his weight as he climbed. The air grew colder, heavier. At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness, lined with doors that leaned slightly open as if waiting for him. He took one step forward and the floor creaked, and then, without warning, every door in the hallway shuddered. Not slammed, not thrown wide, but moved subtly, as if someone on the other side had pressed gently against them all at once. That was when he realized the truth. He was not alone in the house, and whatever waited for him there was not interested in selling anything at all. The investigation into what happened inside that house was not immediate. At first, there was only absence. A car left abandoned at the edge of the driveway, its doors locked, its tires settled deep into the gravel. Inside the car, nothing appeared out of place. Keys still in the ignition, phone resting in the cup holder, cash folded neatly in the glove compartment. It was as if the driver had stepped away for only a moment, but he never returned. When the family reported him missing, the police followed the path traced in his messages. The emails were brief, transactional, and revealed little. A single Craigslist listing that had since been removed, a seller who could not be identified, and directions to a house that, by the time investigators arrived, appeared utterly empty. The officers who entered the house noted what anyone else might have seen: peeling paint, broken furniture, the smell of decay. Yet their descriptions were not uniform. One officer claimed that the house felt colder upstairs, as if the air itself grew heavier near the hallway. Another reported the faint smell of iron in the basement, though nothing resembling blood was found. A third officer, when pressed, admitted he thought he heard a voice whisper his name from the top of the staircase, though no one else reported hearing anything. Their testimonies overlapped in places, diverged in others, but all carried an undertone of unease, as if the house itself had unsettled them in ways they could not quite explain. The physical evidence gathered amounted to little. A single shoe print in the dust of the upstairs hallway, too smudged to identify, a scattering of old personal belongings left behind by previous tenants, photographs curled at the edges, a child's toy missing an arm, a journal with half its pages torn out. The journal contained no complete story, only fragments of sentences that ended abruptly, ink strokes fading into nothing. Forensic analysis suggested the ink was decades old. If the journal belonged to someone who had lived there before, no record of them remained. Neighbors were questioned, though few claimed to know much. One older woman who lived 2 streets over said she had seen lights flickering in the windows at night, though she insisted no one had lived there for years. A man who worked at the gas station said that strangers came into town from time to time looking for the house, but he never saw them leave. When asked why he had not reported this, he simply shrugged and said he assumed they had found what they were looking for. His indifference was unsettling, but he offered nothing more. Digital traces of the seller were equally thin. The email address used in the listing was created only days before, attached to no verifiable identity, and deleted soon after. The photographs of the house that had appeared in the ad were traced back to no existing source, not even from property records. They were images that seemed to exist only for the purpose of that single listing, and then vanished. Psychologists consulted on the case suggested that what happened may not have been purely physical. One theory proposed that the house itself created conditions that heightened paranoia, that the buyer may have panicked and fled into the woods. Yet no tracks were ever found leading away from the property, and search dogs brought to the area refused to cross the threshold of the front door. Handlers noted that the dogs whined, pulled against their leashes, and in some cases sat down firmly as if refusing to move closer. Other theories drifted into darker territory. Some spoke of patterns in the house's history: families who left without explanation, tenants who vanished, unexplained movements seen in the windows. Local records confirmed a long list of occupants over the years, but in nearly every case their departure was abrupt. Property transfers were frequent, ownership shifting from hand to hand until eventually the house fell into foreclosure. Yet no documentation explained why so many had left without selling or settling their debts. It was as if they had walked away and chosen never to return. Even more disturbing were the photographs that surfaced on obscure forums after the investigation. Supposedly screenshots of the original Craigslist listing, these images showed not just the empty rooms, but faint distortions in the corners, shadows that did not match the angle of the light, blurred shapes that resembled figures standing too far back to be seen clearly. Experts dismissed them as compression artifacts, tricks of poor resolution, but those who looked at them closely often reported the same detail: the impression that the figures were watching and that they were aware of being seen. Theories grew from these fragments like weeds. Some insisted the house was a lure used by predators, a place chosen for its isolation, where transactions could be staged and victims silenced. Others believed something less tangible lingered there, something that consumed those who entered. Paranormal groups arrived with cameras and recorders, capturing static-filled voices, unexplainable temperature shifts, and photographs marred by streaks of light that could not be replicated. Their findings were dismissed by authorities but circulated widely online, adding to the house's reputation. The case files themselves were inconclusive. Officially, the missing buyer was listed as unresolved, another disappearance added to a ledger already heavy with unanswered questions. The house remained empty, though whispers claimed it had been listed again, under a different seller, with new photographs that looked eerily similar to the old ones. The deeper one examines the evidence, the less certain the truth becomes. Every piece contradicts another. Every testimony is colored by unease. The shoe print, the journal, the shadows in the photographs, they point in different directions but lead to the same conclusion. Something happened in that house, and whatever it was, it does not want to be understood. And so the analysis becomes not about solving the mystery, but about recognizing its shape. A Craigslist listing that led to an encounter no one can explain. A house that refuses to give answers, but leaves fragments sharp enough to cut at the edges of memory. The closer one looks, the darker it becomes, until even the investigators themselves begin to question not just what they found, but what followed them after they left. The aftermath of the disappearance did not unfold in a single moment. It seeped outward, quiet and corrosive, until it left marks on everyone who came near the case. For the family of the missing buyer, there was first disbelief, then anger, then something heavier that never fully left. They replayed his decisions in their minds endlessly. Every email, every text, every photograph of the house. They tried to convince themselves that he had chosen to walk away, that he was alive somewhere far from them. But the evidence never supported that hope. His car remained, his wallet remained, even his phone remained. What did not remain was him, and that absence was more brutal than any confirmation of death could have been. The family's house became quiet in ways it had never been before. Rooms darkened, meals went untouched, laughter no longer carried through the walls. His belongings remained exactly where he had left them, as if frozen in place, waiting for a return that would never come. His mother spoke less and less, her words collapsing into silence until only her eyes revealed the depth of her grief. His father grew restless, walking the house late at night, staring through windows into the dark as though expecting to see his son's figure coming up the driveway. Grief became a haunting of its own kind, one that followed them no matter how far they tried to run. For the investigators, the case created a different kind of damage. Some of them confessed privately that they never felt the same after stepping inside the house. They dreamed of footsteps pacing the floor above them, of voices murmuring through walls that should have been solid. One officer developed a nervous tic, glancing over his shoulder in empty hallways, convinced someone was watching him even when no one was there. Another requested reassignment, claiming the silence of the place had lodged itself too deeply inside him. Though the case was left unresolved, it resolved itself in their minds in a way that was worse than closure. They believed that something in that house had not wanted them there, and that it had followed them after they left. The town itself felt the weight of the disappearance. It was not the first time someone had gone missing in connection with the house, but this time, the story spread beyond the town's borders. Reporters arrived knocking on doors, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Old rumors resurfaced, whispered in bars and whispered even more urgently behind closed doors. The sense of dread that had hovered over the property for decades thickened, pressing against the community like a storm that would not pass. Parents warned their children to stay away, but the warnings came too late, because children already knew the stories. They dared each other to walk past the house at night, to shine flashlights through the broken windows, to listen for the sound of someone breathing inside. Each dare deepened the myth and deepened the fear. For those closest to the missing buyer, the psychological weight became unbearable. His friends replayed their last conversations with him, scanning for clues they might have missed. Some of them convinced themselves that they had seen changes in him before he left, an unease he never explained, a distracted look in his eyes, moments when his words seemed to trail off into silence as though he were listening to something they could not hear. They questioned whether he had already been marked by the house before he ever set foot inside it. These questions became obsessions, unraveling friendships and hollowing out trust. What lingered most heavily, though, was paranoia. Those who had known him began to notice shadows at the edges of their vision, sounds in their homes that could not be explained. They dismissed them at first, attributing them to stress, to sleeplessness, to the natural disorientation of grief. But the moments grew sharper, more precise. A door that they were sure had been closed stood open. A window latch they remembered securing was suddenly unfastened. Footsteps moved through the night in houses where no one else lived. They tried to rationalize these experiences, but the more they tried, the more impossible it became. Psychologists who studied the family and friends described it as trauma echo, an imprint of grief that reshapes perception. But even they admitted that the intensity was unusual. It was not just sorrow that lingered, but dread, a constant sense of being watched by something unseen. When interviewed, one family member said quietly, "It feels like the house followed us." Another whispered, "I dream of him calling from the basement, but when I open the door, there is no end to the stairs." The human mind was not made for absence. It craves closure, even when closure means horror. Without it, the mind begins to invent possibilities, each darker than the last. For the buyer's family, the possibilities became a labyrinth they could not escape. Was he alive somewhere, trapped, calling out into silence? Or had he been taken into something that could not be named? Each answer was unbearable, but not knowing was worse. The emotional toll radiated outward. The house stood empty, yet it became a presence in conversations, in sleepless nights, in the quiet panic of those who felt its reach. The psychological scars were not limited to those who had entered it. They spread like an infection, feeding on fear and silence. Neighbors reported nightmares, even though they had never stepped inside. Strangers who had only read about the case claimed to feel unsettled when looking at photographs of the house, as though they were being studied by something behind the lens. This is what horror does when it becomes real. It does not remain contained within four walls. It seeps outward, attaching itself to minds, to families, to entire communities. It transforms grief into paranoia, sorrow into dread, and once it takes root, it is almost impossible to remove. The disappearance did not only rob a family of their son, or a community of its peace. It created a silence so heavy that even those who tried to move away carried it with them. In other towns and other houses, they still felt the weight of it pressing in the dark. The house had marked them not only by what it had taken, but by what it had left behind, an endless unease, a whispering absence, a fear that no amount of distance could erase. The official investigation into the house was marked by contradictions from the beginning. Local authorities treated it as a missing person case, nothing more. They searched the surrounding woods, dragged the shallow river that ran behind the town, and combed through nearby abandoned buildings. Their reports described long days that yielded nothing. No footprints beyond the driveway, no broken branches in the forest, no trail to follow. It was as if the missing buyer had walked into the house and dissolved into the walls. When the police finally admitted they had no leads, other groups began to circle. Private investigators hired by the family drove into the town, their cars parked for hours outside the house. Some of them emerged shaken, unwilling to return. One retired officer who had been asked to assist walked through the property only once before refusing further involvement. He told the family quietly, that house does not want to give up its secrets. He never elaborated on what he meant. Rumors spread that investigators had found more than they admitted. One story claimed that a recorder left running in the basement captured faint breathing when no one was present. Another claimed that fingerprints were discovered on the inside of a boarded window, prints that did not match the missing buyer or anyone else in the state database. These rumors were never confirmed and officials denied them, but denial did little to erase them from the public imagination. Theories blossomed, fed by silence and unanswered questions. The first and simplest explanation was human predation. Some believed the house was used as bait, a lure for criminals who targeted strangers seeking easy deals. Craigslist had long carried such dangers: scams, robberies, even murders disguised as harmless transactions. According to this theory, the seller never existed in the way the buyer imagined. He had walked into a trap designed by people who had no intention of delivering keys or property. Yet this explanation faltered against the evidence. Why leave the car untouched, the phone untouched, the cash untouched? Predators rarely left valuables behind. The absence of theft left the theory incomplete. The second explanation reached further into the strange. Paranormal groups arrived in the months after the disappearance, armed with thermal cameras, electromagnetic sensors, and recorders. They spoke of cold spots in the upstairs hallway, of whispers that bled into static on their devices, of lights flickering in rooms with no power connection. One team claimed to have captured a figure on film standing at the top of the stairs, a dark shape, blurred, but with eyes that reflected light unnaturally, like an animal caught in headlights. The footage was dismissed by skeptics as manipulation, but those who watched it closely said the figure was not shaped like any human they had ever seen. The third explanation was psychological. Experts in trauma and suggestion proposed that the house's reputation had infected those who entered it. Fear creates its own distortions, they argued, making people see and hear things that are not there. The missing buyer, in this version, suffered a panic episode, fled into the woods, and succumbed to exposure or accident. Yet this theory too collapsed under scrutiny. Search teams covered the forest in every direction, yet not a single trace of him was ever found. Not clothing, not bones, not even disturbed earth. Fear might explain visions and whispers, but it could not explain absolute absence. Conspiracy theories emerged as well. Online forums filled with speculation that the house was tied to experiments, that it had been used by organizations who erased evidence and silenced witnesses. Some pointed to the shifting property records, noting how quickly ownership changed hands, as though no one wanted their name tied to the place. Others noted that the original Craigslist ad seemed to vanish not only from the site, but from all cached archives, as if someone with influence had wiped it clean. Were powerful figures hiding something? Was the disappearance part of something larger, something meant to be buried? The most disturbing theory, however, came not from officials or investigators but from the locals. Some of them whispered of the house as though it were alive. They said it had taken people before, that once you stepped through its door, you belonged to it. One old man described it as a hunger, a place that fed on those who entered. He told a reporter, "The house does not want to be sold. It wants to be filled." His words unsettled enough people that the interview was never aired in full. Patterns began to emerge. Others had gone missing under similar circumstances. Classified ads, meetings arranged at the property, sudden vanishings. Some cases stretched back decades, long before Craigslist existed. The method had changed with technology, but the outcome remained the same. People came, people entered, people did not return. What made this case different was that it spread further, reaching strangers online who had never set foot in the town. Even among experts, no consensus was ever reached. Each theory collapsed into fragments, each explanation left something vital unanswered. The evidence contradicted itself, like pieces of a puzzle designed never to fit. Those who pursued answers often withdrew before finishing, citing exhaustion, illness, or dread. Some admitted that they feared becoming part of the story themselves if they pushed too far. The house still stood, empty on the surface but surrounded by watchful silence. It was boarded up for a time, then briefly listed again before disappearing from official records altogether. Whether it still exists on some back corner of Craigslist is uncertain, but those who claim to have seen new listings speak of the same photographs, the same shadows, the same promise of a bargain waiting for someone desperate enough to answer. In the end, the investigations left only questions. Was the house a crime scene, a supernatural presence, or a trap crafted by forces no one dared name? Each theory carries its own weight, each one terrifying in its own way. The truth lies buried somewhere between them, in a place no one has yet been able to reach. Perhaps that is the most disturbing possibility of all, that the truth is there, waiting, but no one who touches it ever survives long enough to speak. The house is quiet now. Its windows gape like hollow eyes. Its doors hang loose against their hinges. Its walls lean forward as if listening. On the surface, it is nothing more than a structure collapsing under its own age. To those who have never heard its story, it looks like any other abandoned property along the forgotten backroads of America. But to those who know, to those who have felt its reach, the house is not empty. It is watching, waiting, and remembering. What remains unbearable about the story is not what is known, but what is missing. A man stepped into that house and was erased. No blood, no body, no trail, no conclusion. Everything about him, his car, his phone, his money, was left behind, as though those things meant nothing to whatever claimed him. The simplest answer would be that he was taken by human hands, yet there is no evidence of struggle, no sign of intrusion. If the house was a trap, it was one that worked with silence rather than force. The haunting truth is that absence leaves the heaviest mark. Families cannot mourn properly when there is nothing to bury. Investigators cannot close files when nothing can be proven. Communities cannot heal when silence fills every gap where answers should be. And so the story lingers, heavy as lead, pulling everyone who hears it toward the same inevitable question: what happened inside? Some believe that the house itself feeds on the question, that it grows stronger the longer it goes unanswered. It pulls at human curiosity the way flame pulls at a moth. Each theory, each attempt at explanation is another step closer to the doorway, another chance for the house to open itself again. The internet feeds this hunger endlessly. Forums speculate, videos circulate, photographs resurface, and each retelling adds weight to the myth. The more the story spreads, the more the silence deepens. There are whispers that the Craigslist ad has appeared again, not in the exact form it once did, but close enough. A different email, a slightly different set of photographs, a new price just low enough to tempt someone who feels they have nothing left to lose. Some insist they have seen it, scrolling through late at night, stopping cold when they recognize the house from the grainy images. They swear the shadows in the photographs have shifted, as if the house itself posed for the new listing. The ad vanishes quickly each time, gone before it can be reported, but the memory of it remains. Was it real? Or was it the story itself bleeding into the mind, reshaping imagination into evidence? The house does not answer. It never does. It stands at the edge of a silent town, boarded windows staring outward, doors waiting. Every so often a car is seen parked in its driveway again, headlights cutting through the dark. Locals claim they look away, unwilling to witness another beginning. They say it is easier to let the silence grow than to invite whatever waits inside to notice them. This is what makes the story unbearable to forget. It does not end. It does not even pause. It waits for the next person, the next bargain, the next desperate soul willing to trade suspicion for hope. And once the door swings open, the cycle begins again. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is that the missing buyer is not gone. Perhaps he is still inside, somewhere behind the walls, trapped in silence. Perhaps all the others are too. Layers of absence pressed together, unseen but never erased. What if the house does not destroy those who enter but keeps them? What if every shadow in the window is not distortion, but someone staring back, waiting for help that will never arrive? The story is unfinished, and it always will be. Each telling ends with the same hollow weight, the same silence pressing in from the corners. And maybe that silence is the truest horror of all, that something has been taken, something has been consumed, and nothing will ever fill the space it left behind. So the question remains, heavy and sharp as broken glass: would you ever answer an ad that leads you to a stranger's house? Would you walk through the door if the price was just right? Would you ignore the unease, convince yourself it was nothing, and take the first step inside? Because if you do, you may discover that the house is not selling anything. It is only waiting, and what it wants is you.